I was 12 when my parents signed me away because they believed I wasn't smart enough to deserve a future. Years later, I uncovered a secret so terrifying that it destroyed the man they trusted and exposed the price they accepted for giving me up. If you enjoy true-to-life emotional stories filled with shocking twists, subscribe now and stay until the end, because every detail matters. My name is Isabella Moreau. If someone had asked me when I was 12 what kind of future I imagined for myself, I probably would have shrugged. I wasn't the top student in my class. I wasn't talented enough to stand out in sports, music, or art. I struggled to keep up with math, forgot homework more often than I wanted to admit, and spent most of my school days hearing adults compare me to children who seemed smarter, faster, and more promising. Eventually, I stopped defending myself. It was easier to believe them. The day my life changed forever started like any other Tuesday. Rain tapped softly against the car windows as my parents drove through downtown Portland. Neither of them spoke much. My mother stared out the passenger side window while my father kept both hands tightly wrapped around the steering wheel. The silence felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. I thought we were going to another meeting with my school counselor. Instead, we parked in front of the county courthouse. I looked at my father. "Why are we here?" He didn't answer. My mother finally turned toward me, forcing a smile that looked more uncomfortable than reassuring. "It'll only take a little while." That sentence stayed with me for years. Inside the courthouse, everything smelled like polished wood and old paper. People walked confidently through the hallways carrying folders and briefcases while I followed behind my parents, trying to understand why nobody would explain anything. Then I saw him. Roland Vesper. Technically, he was my uncle through marriage, although I had only met him a handful of times growing up. He was always dressed perfectly, always calm, always smiling just enough to seem trustworthy. He greeted my parents warmly before resting a hand on my shoulder. "There she is." His voice was gentle. Too gentle. I forced a polite smile. He asked me about school. I told him it wasn't going very well. He nodded as though that confirmed something he already knew. Soon after, we entered a courtroom no larger than a classroom. There was no jury, no dramatic speeches, only a judge, a clerk, several documents, and adults discussing my future as though I wasn't sitting 3 feet away. I heard words I didn't understand. Guardianship, temporary placement, educational opportunity, best interests of the child. Nobody explained what those words actually meant. The judge asked my parents several routine questions. They answered confidently. Roland signed his papers. Then my parents signed theirs. The judge approved everything within minutes. That was it. At 12 years old, I legally stopped living with my parents. Nobody asked whether I wanted that. Outside the courthouse, I expected my parents to tell me when I'd be coming home. Instead, my father placed my backpack into Roland's SUV. My mother hugged me quickly. "We're doing what's best for you." I looked from one face to the other. "When do I come back?" Neither of them answered immediately. Roland did. "You'll be staying with me from now on." I laughed nervously because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I turned back toward my parents. My father couldn't even look me in the eyes. My mother whispered, "You'll understand someday." Then they climbed into their car. I watched them drive away. They never looked back. The entire drive to Seattle felt unreal. Roland tried making small talk about schools, opportunities, and fresh starts, but I barely heard him. My mind stayed fixed on one question. Why? Hours later, we arrived at his estate. Calling it a house would have been unfair. The property sat behind iron gates surrounded by tall evergreen trees that blocked almost every neighboring home from view. Security cameras covered every entrance. Landscaped gardens stretched across the front yard with the precision of a luxury resort. It looked like the kind of place people admired in magazines. Inside, everything was spotless. Too spotless. Nothing appeared out of place. Every clock showed the correct time. Every chair sat perfectly aligned. Every employee greeted Roland with rehearsed professionalism before immediately returning to work. A woman introduced herself as the house manager and escorted me upstairs. My bedroom was larger than the apartment where my parents and I had lived. The furniture was expensive. The bed was comfortable. The closet already contained new clothes in my size. Someone had prepared everything before I even arrived. That realization unsettled me. This hadn't been a last-minute decision. It had been planned. Dinner was served exactly at 6. Breakfast would be served exactly at 7. Study sessions started at 8. Lights out at 10. Every hour of every day had already been scheduled. Roland explained the rules politely. I believe structure creates successful people. First, I thought maybe he was simply strict. Then the rules kept growing. No personal phone. No social media. No visiting friends. No leaving the property alone. No contacting my parents unless Roland approved it first. He called them reasonable boundaries. I quietly accepted them because I didn't know what else to do. Over the following months, I realized something else. I never actually spoke to my parents again. Whenever I asked to call them, Roland would smile sympathetically. They're very busy. When I wrote letters, they supposedly never replied. When birthdays came, no gifts arrived. No cards. No phone calls. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself they had moved on without me. School became online tutoring arranged entirely by Roland. The teachers changed frequently. None stayed long enough for me to build trust. Whenever I asked questions about my guardianship, someone redirected the conversation. Whenever I mentioned going home, people exchanged uncomfortable looks before changing the subject. Years passed inside routines that slowly erased any memory of normal childhood. Still, one habit never left me. I noticed details. Tiny details. Which employee always looked nervous? Which doors stayed locked? Which hallways cameras didn't fully cover? Which rooms Roland entered only after everyone else had gone to sleep? I didn't realize it then, but those observations would someday matter far more than my report cards ever had. One cold evening about 6 months after moving into Roland's estate, the power briefly flickered during a thunderstorm. The security system reset. Several electronic locks clicked open at once. I had been carrying a stack of books back to the library when I noticed the hallway door standing slightly open. I had never seen it unlocked before. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The staircase led downward into a quiet basement unlike the rest of the mansion. There were no decorations. No windows. Only rows of metal filing cabinets stretching across the room. Each cabinet had neatly printed labels. Each drawer contained dozens of folders. Every folder displayed a child's name. Some looked old. Some looked brand new. My heartbeat quickened. Then I saw a familiar label. Isabella Morrow. I slowly pulled the folder from the cabinet. What I found inside would destroy everything I believed about why I had been sent away. And before I could finish reading the first page, footsteps echoed behind me. I froze. The folder was still open in my hands when the footsteps stopped just outside the basement office. For a split second, I considered shoving the file back into the cabinet and pretending I had wandered downstairs by accident. But it was too late. Isabella. Roland's calm voice echoed through the room. I've been looking for you. I slowly turned around. He stood in the doorway wearing the same composed smile he wore in front of judges, donors, and television cameras. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have seen nothing alarming. Just a successful guardian checking on a curious teenager. His eyes, however, told a different story. They weren't angry. They were calculating. What are you reading? He asked. I looked down at the folder. My file. He stepped closer without rushing. Those records are confidential. I found 2 evaluations. His smile didn't disappear. So, they say completely different things. For the first time since I had met him, Roland didn't answer immediately. One report came from a licensed child psychologist who had tested me several months before I left my parents' home. According to that report, I wasn't intellectually behind at all. My grades reflected inconsistent concentration and anxiety, but my memory, pattern recognition, and emotional awareness scored well above average. The second report painted a completely different picture. It claimed I had severe cognitive limitations. The signatures belonged to different doctors. The hospital names were different. Even as a teenager, I could see something wasn't right. Which one is real? I asked. Roland gently reached for the folder. The first assessment wasn't reliable. Why? It used outdated methods. But it says. He interrupted me. Some information only creates confusion. Before I could protest, he closed the folder. I'll keep this. He slid it under his arm as though it were nothing more than ordinary paperwork. I think it's time for bed. That was the end of the conversation. At least that was what he wanted. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The hallway leading to the basement had been locked again. 2 maintenance workers spent the entire day carrying furniture downstairs. By evening the office was gone. Within a week, the basement had been remodeled into a climate-controlled wine cellar. The filing cabinets had vanished. So had every folder. Nobody mentioned them again. For a long time I wondered if I had imagined everything. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe there had been a reasonable explanation. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look on Roland's face when I asked which report was real. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. He hadn't expected me to notice the difference. Years continued to pass. Life inside Roland's estate became increasingly structured. At 14, I was enrolled in private online courses. At 15, every tutor signed confidentiality agreements before teaching me. At 16, I noticed visitors arriving late at night. Most wore business suits. Some wore medical uniforms. Others carried locked briefcases. Meetings always happened behind closed doors. Whenever I walked nearby, conversations stopped. Roland introduced them as consultants. Yet none of them ever acted like teachers or doctors. They behaved like executives negotiating contracts. The mansion itself also changed. New surveillance cameras appeared every few months. Electronic keypads replaced ordinary locks. Entire wings of the house became restricted. The staff rotated constantly. Faces disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Only one employee remained throughout those years. His name was Arthur. He handled maintenance around the estate. Unlike everyone else, Arthur never spoke more than necessary. Still, he occasionally offered small acts of kindness. If I forgot a jacket outside, he quietly brought it in. If a bookshelf broke, he fixed it without complaint. If I asked how long he had worked there, he always gave the same answer. Long enough. I never realized then how important Arthur would eventually become. When I turned 18, Roland surprised me. I've arranged your college education. I expected freedom. Instead, he handed me acceptance papers from a university almost entirely funded by one of his charitable foundations. Campus housing wasn't required. He had already purchased a condominium less than 10 minutes away. I've also hired security. I don't need security. Everyone connected to my foundation receives protection. Protection. That was his favorite word. Everything controlling became protection. Every restriction became concern. Every closed door became responsibility. I moved into the condominium anyway because refusing never seemed like a real option. College introduced me to people my own age for the first time in years. Most students complained about exams, roommates, and deadlines. I struggled with conversations. I didn't know how normal friendships worked anymore. Still, something inside me slowly changed. The more independent I became, the less convincing Roland's explanations sounded. I began visiting public libraries instead of going straight home. I read about guardianship law, family court procedures, medical documentation, fraud investigations. The legal language that once confused 12-year-old me finally started making sense. One question kept returning. Why would anyone need 2 completely different psychological evaluations for the same child? There had to be a reason. I just couldn't see it yet. 7 years passed. I graduated. Roland invited me to work for one of his nonprofit organizations, saying he wanted me to continue the family's legacy. Refusing him still felt impossible, so I accepted. My position required attending conferences across the country, meeting healthcare administrators, legal consultants, and charity executives. Most events blurred together. Expensive hotels, polished speeches, networking dinners. Then one conference changed everything. It took place in Chicago. During a coffee break between presentations, I walked toward a refreshment table. An elderly woman poured coffee into paper cups with practiced movements. She glanced up for less than a second. Then she stopped. The coffee overflowed onto the table. She stared at me as though she had seen a ghost. "I know you," she whispered. I frowned. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" Instead of answering, she looked around the crowded conference hall. Then she quietly slipped a folded piece of paper beneath my notebook before walking away without another word. My heart pounded. I unfolded it beneath the table. There was only one sentence written in careful handwriting. The original guardianship records were never destroyed. At the bottom of the note was a place. A small diner. Tomorrow morning. 6:30. I read the note 3 times. Someone else knew about the courthouse. Someone else knew those records had existed. And for the first time since I was 12 years old, I realized I might not have been the only person who remembered. I barely slept that night. The folded note stayed inside my wallet, and I checked it so many times that the edges began to crease. The original guardianship records were never destroyed. Those 8 words replayed in my head over and over. Who was that woman? How did she know my name? More importantly, why had she waited until now? The next morning, Chicago was unusually quiet. A light drizzle covered the sidewalks as I walked toward the diner listed on the note. It wasn't one of those trendy places filled with business meetings. It was small, old, and nearly empty at that hour. Only 3 customers sat inside. The elderly woman was already there. She chose a booth near the back window where she could see both the entrance and the parking lot. As I approached, she gave me a nervous smile. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. I understand. I slid into the booth across from her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she extended her hand. My name is Marlene Keats. I shook it. I'm Isabella. I know. There was no surprise in her voice. I remember the day you walked into the courthouse. A chill ran through me. You were there. She nodded. I worked as a senior records clerk for nearly 30 years. You remember me after all this time? I remember every child whose paperwork made me uncomfortable. The waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. I've spent years wondering why my parents gave me away, I admitted. Marlene looked down at the table. I don't think your story began with your parents. What does that mean? She reached into her purse and removed an old envelope. Inside were photocopies of documents. Some pages had official court stamps. Others contained handwritten notes. She slid the papers toward me. I wasn't supposed to make copies. You copied confidential files? I copied suspicious files. I stared at her. Why? Because too many children disappeared into legal guardianships that didn't make sense. My pulse quickened. What do you mean by disappeared? They didn't vanish physically. She leaned closer. They vanished legally. I frowned. I don't understand. After guardianship transfers, their school records changed. Their medical providers changed. Their mailing addresses changed. Sometimes their names changed. She paused. And once that happened, almost nobody asked questions. I looked down at the documents. Several unrelated children's names appeared beside court case numbers. Different counties. Different years. One name appeared again. Roland Vesper. Not as a guardian every time. Sometimes as a sponsor. Sometimes as a legal representative. Sometimes through organizations connected to his charitable foundation. His name kept appearing. Again. And again. And again. This can't be a coincidence. It isn't. Marlene's voice remained calm. I noticed the pattern almost 20 years ago. Why didn't anyone investigate? They tried. What happened? The evidence always disappeared. I looked back at her. Just like my file. She nodded slowly. Exactly like your file. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Outside, cars rolled past the rain-covered windows. Inside the diner, the sound of dishes clinking against porcelain suddenly seemed much louder. There was one thing that always bothered me, Marlene continued. What's that? You weren't the first child whose records contained 2 different psychological evaluations. I felt my stomach tighten. There were others? Several. Did they all end up with Roland? Not all. But enough. I stared at the copies in disbelief. What was he doing? I didn't know then. And now? She hesitated. I still don't know the whole picture. The answer frustrated me. So we've come all this way just to confirm something suspicious happened? No. She smiled faintly. I asked you here because I kept something. From inside her purse, she produced a small brass key attached to a faded plastic tag. Storage Unit C114. I looked at it. What's this? The reason I survived. She carefully placed the key in my hand. When I retired, I couldn't bring myself to destroy everything I'd copied over the years. You kept all of it? Not at home. Where? She pointed toward the key. In a storage facility outside the city. My heart raced. What exactly is inside? Duplicate court records. Only mine. No. How many? She looked directly into my eyes. Hundreds. I struggled to process the number. Hundreds. I documented every case that looked unusual. My breathing became shallow. If those records still exist, they can establish patterns. And patterns lead to investigations. She smiled for the first time. Now you're thinking like someone who notices details. We finished our coffee in silence before leaving together. The storage facility sat about 20 minutes away in an industrial district surrounded by warehouses and trucking companies. The sky had cleared by the time we arrived. Rows of metal units stretched across the property. Marlene unlocked the gate using an access card she had kept active for years. Nobody knows this place is connected to me. We stopped in front of Unit C114. She inserted the brass key. The lock clicked open. The metal door rolled upward. Inside stood dozens of labeled archive boxes stacked neatly from floor to ceiling. Every box contained carefully organized files. Years. Counties. Case numbers. Names. I stepped inside slowly. This is unbelievable. It took me nearly 15 years to collect. I picked up one box. Every document had been cataloged. Cross-referenced. Dated. Nothing looked random. This could expose everything. It could. Then Marlene's expression changed. She looked toward the entrance. What is it? I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, We're not alone. I turned. A black SUV had just entered the storage facility. It wasn't slowing down. It was coming straight toward our unit. The black SUV sped down the narrow lane between the storage units. Its windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see who was inside. Marlene didn't hesitate. Closed the door. Together, we pulled the heavy metal door down just enough to leave a narrow gap near the floor. The SUV stopped outside. Its engine continued running. Neither of us spoke. Footsteps approached. Slow. Measured. Someone tested the handle. The lock held. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. Then the footsteps moved away. A vehicle door slammed. Seconds later, the SUV drove off. Only after the sound of the engine disappeared did either of us breathe normally again. Did they see us? I whispered. I don't know. Marlene looked far less relieved than I felt. Assume they did. We raised the door again and immediately began working. There wasn't time to read every document, so we focused on anything connected directly to Roland Vesper. The first archive box contained court records. The second contained copies of guardianship petitions. The third changed everything. Instead of legal paperwork, it held financial documents, canceled checks, insurance reimbursements, donation ledgers, internal payment summaries. Every file connected one name to another. Children, guardianships, medical facilities, private charities, corporate accounts. First, none of it made sense. Then Marlene spread several pages across an old folding table. Look at the dates. I compared them. A child entered Roland's guardianship. Within weeks, the child appeared in records from one of his rehabilitation centers. Several months later, insurance payments increased. Government support funds increased. Charitable grants increased. Another transfer. Another payment. Another child. The pattern repeated dozens of times. I stared at the documents. He wasn't adopting children because he wanted a family. No. He wasn't rescuing struggling kids. No. Marlene folded her arms. He was expanding a business. The realization left me speechless. Every child represented another stream of income. Some facilities billed insurance companies for long-term treatment. Others collected public funding through specialized educational programs. Several received generous donations from wealthy benefactors who believed they were helping vulnerable children recover. The children themselves became financial assets. Not people. Assets. I flipped through another stack. Many records included psychological evaluations. Several looked strangely familiar. Different names. Same wording. Entire paragraphs repeated almost word for word. Only the children's names had changed. They copied reports, I whispered. They manufactured them. Marlene nodded. If a child needed to appear emotionally unstable, the paperwork reflected that. And if they didn't, they simply rewrote the evaluation. My thoughts immediately returned to the two reports inside my own file. One described the real me. The other described someone who barely existed. Roland hadn't needed me to actually be intellectually limited. He only needed the paperwork to say I was. That paperwork justified everything that followed. I kept searching. Another folder contained correspondence between attorneys. One letter caught my attention. It referenced something called the Continuity Initiative. What is this? Marlene shook her head. I've seen that phrase before, but I never figured out what it meant. The document mentioned expanding facilities across Washington, Oregon, and Nevada. It also referenced maintaining long-term guardianship stability to ensure predictable funding. Predictable funding. The phrase made my skin crawl. Children weren't being discussed as lives. They were being discussed as investments. As we continued organizing evidence, another discovery emerged. Several signatures belonged to doctors who had died years earlier. Others belonged to physicians whose medical licenses had been revoked before the reports were supposedly written. Someone had forged evaluations on an enormous scale. This is fraud, I said. It's much bigger than fraud. Marlene looked toward the growing pile of evidence. This required lawyers, doctors, accountants, administrators. None of this could have happened through one man acting alone. Roland had built an entire network. Suddenly my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I ignored it. A few seconds later it rang again. Unknown number. Again. Then again. 5 calls within 3 minutes. Marlene noticed. Don't answer. I silenced the phone. Moments later, another sound echoed outside. This time it wasn't an engine. It was the metallic crash of another storage unit door opening somewhere nearby. Voices. More than one person. We quickly gathered the most important documents into 2 archive boxes. If they come back, we leave everything else, Marlene said. What about the rest? Evidence only matters if someone survives to deliver it. We carried the boxes toward my rental car parked near the entrance. Before we reached it, I noticed something strange. The lock on my trunk had been forced open. I stopped walking. I didn't leave it like that. Marlene immediately looked around. Get back. Too late. The storage unit behind us exploded with the sound of collapsing cardboard. We spun around. Someone had already gone inside. Boxes lay scattered across the floor. Folders covered the concrete like fallen leaves. The archive we had just organized had been torn apart in less than 2 minutes. They found it, I whispered. No. Marlene surprised me. They found what I wanted them to find. I stared at her. What are you talking about? She calmly bent down and picked up one of the scattered folders. Feel it. The paper felt different. Lighter. Cheaper. I looked closer. Every page had a faint watermark reading. Copy. I blinked. These aren't the originals. No. Then where are they? She smiled for the first time since the SUV appeared. I've spent 20 years expecting someone to come looking. You planned for this? I planned for people like Roland. She reached into her coat pocket and removed another key. This one was newer. Smaller. No label. The real archive has never been stored here. My heartbeat quickened again. Who has it? I don't. You just said. She interrupted me. I entrusted it to someone who spent 25 years inside Roland's organization. I frowned. Who? She looked directly at me. The only man who knew where every dollar went. The accountant. She nodded once. His name is Cedric Harlow. Then she added the sentence that changed everything once again. And he's finally ready to talk. I expected Roland's chief accountant to look intimidating. Instead, Cedric Harlow looked exhausted. Marlene and I met him 2 nights later in a quiet fishing town along the Washington coast, far from the cities where Roland's foundation operated. Cedric had insisted on choosing the location himself. According to him, He never held important conversations anywhere predictable. The restaurant overlooked a small marina. Only a handful of customers sat inside. Cedric arrived exactly on time carrying nothing except a weathered leather briefcase. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't smile. He simply sat down and looked at me for several seconds. "So," he finally said, "you're Isabella. You know who I am? I've known who you are for almost 14 years. My stomach tightened. You worked for Roland. I worked for his companies. What's the difference? A very important one." The waitress took our drink orders before leaving us alone. Cedric rested both hands on the briefcase. "I handled accounting." "Then you know what he did." "I know what the numbers say." "Isn't that the same thing?" He slowly shook his head. "No. Numbers don't explain motives. They only prove actions." For someone who had spent decades behind spreadsheets, he chose his words carefully. Marlene leaned forward. "You told me you were ready." "I am." Cedric unlocked the briefcase. Inside wasn't cash. It wasn't paper files. It contained 3 encrypted hard drives, several flash drives, and a thick binder covered in handwritten notes. "I've been collecting evidence for 25 years. I stared at him. "Why wait this long?" His expression hardened. "Because nobody would have believed one accountant accusing one of the country's most celebrated philanthropists." "So why now?" "Because Roland made a mistake." "What mistake?" He stopped paying attention. Cedric opened the binder. Every page contained handwritten references linking financial transactions to specific guardianship cases. Donation numbers, insurance claims, corporate transfers, property purchases, everything connected. Roland's charitable foundation accepted donations from wealthy benefactors who believed they were funding rehabilitation programs for vulnerable children. Those donations moved through multiple nonprofit organizations. From there, the money entered privately owned companies. Those companies owned treatment facilities. The facilities billed insurance providers for services that were exaggerated, unnecessary, or sometimes never performed at all. Every legal guardianship expanded the flow of money. Children weren't merely part of the system. They were the system. Cedric turned another page. This column lists guardianship approvals. Another page. This one tracks medical reimbursements. Another. These are internal transfers between shell companies. I recognized Roland's signature repeatedly. Different years. Different documents. Always the same confident handwriting. Then Cedric pointed toward a highlighted entry. Case number. I'm 427. My initials. My case. The reimbursement attached to my guardianship transfer totaled more money than my parents earned in several years combined. I couldn't speak. "What is this?" Cedric answered quietly. "The financial value assigned to your case." The words hit harder than anything I had learned so far. Not because of the amount, because someone had calculated my worth on a spreadsheet. Marlene broke the silence. Did her parents know? Cedric closed the binder. I can answer that now. He opened another folder. Inside were scanned bank records, wire transfers, deposit slips, signed acknowledgments. Each document carried names I recognized immediately. My mother's, my father's. Several transfers had been made into a joint account only weeks after they surrendered legal custody. I felt as though the room had disappeared around me. They accepted money. Cedric nodded. They signed confidentiality agreements as part of the transfer. I wanted him to tell me there had been a mistake, that the signatures were forged, that someone had impersonated them. Instead, he quietly slid one final document across the table. It was a notarized receipt. My father's signature appeared at the bottom. There was no denying it. For years I had imagined countless explanations. Maybe they had been manipulated. Maybe they had been threatened. Maybe they had believed Roland would provide a better life. The truth was simpler. They had agreed to the arrangement. No one had forced them. No one had deceived them. They chose it. I looked out toward the marina, unable to process the realization. Roland had stolen my childhood. My parents had sold their responsibility. Neither truth hurt less than the other. Cedric allowed several minutes of silence before speaking again. There's one more thing. I turned back. The financial evidence alone isn't enough. What do you mean? It proves fraud. But it doesn't prove conspiracy. Marlene frowned. So what's missing? Witnesses. Cedric tapped the binder. I've documented the money. You documented the records. He looked at both of us. But investigators need people. People. Former children. Former employees. Doctors. Administrators. Accountants. Lawyers. An entire network of witnesses. Only then could prosecutors demonstrate that Roland's organization wasn't making isolated mistakes. It was operating an organized criminal enterprise. Cedric reached into his jacket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It contained dozens of names. Some had check marks beside them. Who are they? People willing to testify. There are this many? There are more. Hope began replacing disbelief. For the first time, this didn't feel impossible. It felt real. 3 days later, Cedric formally contacted federal investigators. Within hours, he surrendered every encrypted drive, every accounting record, every financial statement, every internal email he had secretly preserved. The investigation expanded immediately. Agents requested interviews. Subpoenas followed. Search warrants were approved. Banks froze corporate accounts connected to Roland's network. Television stations began reporting that several healthcare organizations were under federal investigation for possible financial misconduct. Roland still appeared in public. He gave interviews. He smiled for cameras. He insisted the accusations were politically motivated. He called them misunderstandings. He believed his reputation would protect him. Then, early one Friday morning, everything changed. Federal agents executed coordinated search warrants across rehabilitation centers in Washington, Oregon, and Nevada at the exact same time. Computers were seized. Financial records disappeared into evidence boxes. Executives were escorted out in handcuffs. Employees began cooperating almost immediately. Roland tried leaving the country aboard his private jet. Airport authorities stopped him before the aircraft left the runway. News helicopters captured the entire arrest. The image spread across every major television network before sunset. I watched it alone. Not with satisfaction. Not with celebration. Only with the quiet realization that the man who had controlled every part of my life for more than a decade no longer controlled the future. But the hardest confrontation still hadn't happened. For the first time in 14 years, my parents asked to see me. I hadn't seen my parents in 14 years. Not once. No birthday cards. No phone calls. No unexpected visits. Nothing. Then, less than a week after Roland's arrest dominated the national news, I received a message from an attorney representing them. They wanted to meet. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part had spent years imagining what I would say if this day ever came. In the end, curiosity won. We agreed to meet in a conference room inside a federal building in Seattle. Their lawyers requested a neutral location because multiple investigations were still ongoing. When I walked inside, they were already waiting. They looked older, smaller. The confidence I remembered from childhood had disappeared. For several seconds, nobody spoke. My mother stood first. Isabella. She stepped forward as if she intended to hug me. I took one step back. She stopped. I've missed you. The sentence landed awkwardly between us. I simply looked at her. Missed me? For 14 years. Without a single letter? Without even trying. My father cleared his throat. We made terrible mistakes. I finally spoke. No. Both of them looked up. You made decisions. Silence filled the room. My mother began crying. We thought Roland would give you opportunities we never could. I shook my head. No. She frowned. I've seen the bank records. The color drained from both their faces. You accepted money. Neither answered. I've seen the signed receipts. Still nothing. I've seen the confidentiality agreements. Finally, my father lowered his eyes. We were drowning in debt. I know. He offered us a way out. I know. We thought. His voice broke. We thought you would have a better life. I looked at him for a long moment. Did you ever ask me what I wanted? He couldn't answer. Did you ever visit? Silence. Did you ever write? Nothing. Did you ever try to bring me home? My mother covered her face with both hands. The answer to every question was already obvious. No, 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 no. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When I stood to leave, my mother reached toward me one final time. Can you ever forgive us? I thought carefully before answering. I can stop carrying anger. She looked hopeful. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Then I walked away. It was the last conversation we ever had. Months later, the federal trial began. The courtroom was far larger than the one where my guardianship had been approved years earlier. This time I understood every legal term, every objection, every piece of evidence. Former employees testified. Doctors admitted their reports had been altered. Administrators described years of financial manipulation. Several attorneys accepted plea agreements in exchange for cooperation. Then Cedric took the witness stand. For 3 days he explained every financial transaction, every hidden company, every fraudulent reimbursement, every illegal payment. His records matched Marlene's archived documents perfectly. The evidence fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for decades. Finally, I testified. The prosecutor asked simple questions. What happened at age 12? How did Roland control my life? When did I discover the contradictory evaluations? How did the restrictions affect me? I answered honestly. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't seek revenge. The truth was enough. After nearly 5 months of testimony, the verdict arrived. Roland Vesper was found guilty on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, wire fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering, document falsification, and operating an illegal guardianship scheme for financial gain. Several senior executives received prison sentences. Multiple rehabilitation centers permanently closed. The charitable foundation dissolved under court supervision. Its remaining assets were sold to compensate survivors and repay stolen public funds. My parents were charged separately. The investigation concluded they had knowingly accepted illegal payments in exchange for transferring custody under false representations. They lost their home, their savings, their professional licenses. The money they accepted all those years earlier disappeared through restitution orders and legal penalties. They had traded their daughter for financial security. In the end, they lost both. That wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Life slowly became quieter after the trials ended. For the first time since childhood, nobody decided where I lived. Nobody monitored my phone. Nobody approved my schedule. Freedom felt strangely unfamiliar. One afternoon, several former children connected to Roland's guardianship network gathered at a community center in Seattle. Some had been separated from siblings. Others had spent years believing they had simply been unwanted. Listening to their stories changed something inside me. I realized I wasn't the only person trying to rebuild a stolen life. Together, we created a nonprofit organization offering free legal assistance to children trapped in abusive guardianship arrangements. Volunteer attorneys joined us. Retired judges offered guidance. Licensed therapists donated their time. Former investigators trained our staff on recognizing fraudulent documentation. What began as a support group slowly became a nationwide advocacy organization. Every child we helped reminded me why the truth mattered. People had once measured my value using grades. Later, Roland measured my value using financial spreadsheets. Both had been wrong. A person's worth cannot be calculated by intelligence tests, report cards, or accounting records. It is measured by the choices they make when they finally have the freedom to choose. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have understood at 12 years old. Being underestimated didn't define my future. It simply allowed dangerous people to believe I would never question them. They underestimated the one thing they could never erase. My memory. I remembered the courthouse. I remembered the basement. I remembered the 2 psychological evaluations. And because I never forgot those details, an entire criminal network that had hidden behind wealth and charity finally collapsed. If you've stayed with me until the end of my story, thank you for listening. I hope this story reminds you that the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful people spend years trying to bury it. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next unforgettable story. You never know which ordinary moment will become the beginning of an extraordinary truth.